Hello and welcome to Winter Alumni College and Dickinson's Daughters. My name is Stephanie Maringer and I am the Assistant Director of Regional Programs here at the College of Wooster. Joining me tonight is Kathleen Moore, Assistant Director of Annual Giving Operations, and Amy Ladrick, who's our Administrative Assistant and Building Manager for our beloved Galt Alumni Center. If you need any assistance with Zoom tonight, please send us a message in the chat or try to flag one of us down. We are happy to help you. We'll make sure we solve or at least attempt to solve any of your tech issues. You can also use the chat to communicate with each other. We would love to hear where you all are joining us from tonight. And you can also pose any questions throughout the course using the chat. To fully participate in tonight's course and to make this virtual environment closely resemble a Wooster classroom, we are encouraging you to turn on your video so that we can all feel like we are in community with each other and participating. And then in an effort to make this course as accessible as possible, we have a live transcript available for you to view along the way by clicking on the live link up in the top left-hand corner of your screen. It says live on otter.ai. I will also provide you with the link to that in the chat. And we are recording this course tonight, so be mindful of that. Try not to move around too much in your screen if you can avoid it. And just keep your bright smiling faces on. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I want to turn everything over to Eleanor Heginbotham and thank her so much for leading this course for us tonight. So take it away, Ellie.
This is so much fun. Hi, everybody. I don't know if they're on yet, but people I know very well are here, including my dear roommate and a dear friend from her freshman year and my junior year, and distinguished alums. And I don't know if she's on yet, but the real celebrity is Sally Patton. Who is she on the screen? There she is. Sally, dear Sally, it's so lovely to see you. So this is such a thrill for me to see everybody. Is Isaac on yet? He's a student. And we go from those of us of the class of 1960 to the class of 1921. Is Isaac on? I don't see him yet. He probably is studying for an exam, but if he comes on, that will be fun. So what a great idea this is, Stephanie, that you've had to do this so that we can gather generations. And I dedicate this to the smells and the feel of cow call in 1960, between 1956 and 1960, which was, it looked somewhat the same, but it had a whole different aura, I can guarantee you, from my trips back. And to the people there who were the ones who made me an English professor finally, to scholarly, this will mean a lot to a few people. Dr. Coolidge, droll Tom Clarison, formidable, awesome Dot Mateer, lovable David Molstad, tragic Dr. Molstad, Dr. Bradford, and the eminent teacher of teachers and scholar Howard Lowry, whom we were all privileged to know. The rest of you can make your own list of favorite people in the English department, but I really thank you for coming to revisit the campus in this magical way we have to do. And I'm going to ask, first of all, sort of like a class, I'm going to ask 3 questions and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. So at least I'll get a sense of who's here. My first question is, how many of you were English majors at either at Wooster or someplace else? Raise your hands. Okay, good. Now I have to go to the other screen because there are 2 screens worth. That's 3. Anybody else? Oh, good. Holly, Haley. So nice to meet you. The second question is, how many of you are teachers or were teachers, have been teachers? So many people. Yes, that's what we do at Wooster. We turn out teachers, which is what made Sally Patton's job so hard. We all went into these service jobs. We didn't go into high-powered industry. but good. Now, the third question is, how many people here have been to the Dickinson Museum in to Amherst to see the house? Several, oh, quite a few. Oh, that's good. So you are well versed in things Dickinsonian, and you can put comments in the chat whenever you want if I forget something very, very important. So I'm so happy to meet you and to know what a dynamic group this is, and we're all gathered because we're all Wooster people in some way. When some of us graduated in 1960, Emily Dickinson was not the Emily Dickinson we have today by any stretch of the imagination. So whatever we learned from Mr. Clareson or whoever was teaching American lit at the time, she changed. And the people, her daughters, are part of the change that has been wrought. So we're going to learn about them and a number of daughters, not just the four I mentioned, but there are other really remarkable people who bring us the Emily Dickinson we have today. What I'm going to do is take a chance. I don't know whether you heard Jamie Raskin, my congressman, today at the beginning of the testimony. He said that he was quoting Auden, a professor is someone who speaks while others are sleeping. So I'm really taking a terrible chance to do a PowerPoint, but it's the only way I can fit what I want to do into this compressed period. And I'll go very fast. I'll warn you, I'll go very fast. So what you need to do is have those 3 packets ready. At the beginning, we'll be in the timeline of Emily Dickinson, which is the 2nd page of the first packet, and a little bit in the packet of poems as well. And then we'll move at a certain point into the modern poets, beginning with Marianne Moore. And for the most part, anything that you have a question about should be answered on there. As I give you just this sort of whiff, a little soupçon of what is available in this particular topic. Just to get us started, I wanted to show you the topicality that Emily Dickinson is not dead. This, I think you can maybe see a little bit of it. A newspaper, this is from January 16th, this year, a month ago. The whole page, an entire page of the editorial page was devoted to letters from various people. And every single article has a Dickinson line on the top. I don't know if you can see that. Wild Nights is this one. It's a review of the Perfectly Dreadful movie. And there's an ecology article, Inebriate of Air is the title on that. So all of these lines of Dickinson's are sprinkled all over the page. It's the whole page. Emily Dickinson and current readers. She's in the news. She's with us today. She's topical. And with that in mind, I'm going to go to our PowerPoint, from which I beg you to stay awake and leave your pictures on, because as Stephanie said, we're going to interrupt a few times. I'm not going to leave the PowerPoint, but I am going to interrupt for you to hear your voices. And I'll ask you to identify. And I want you, please, not to be, scared Presbyterians in the back of the church. You have to be Dickinson bold and speak up when I offer you the option. And I know we have at least one actress in the group, Sally. So I expect great readings a little later. Okay, so I think I should do the share screen, right, Stephanie? All right, and we will pray that this goes well. Okay. Whoops. Uh-oh. It did not, because the screen left. So now I have to go back. Can you all see what I see, which is not what I want you to see.
I
so
can
that's
see your
not
browser.
good. Let's see, I'm going to stop share, go back. Okay, share screen. We do that. Oh, that's curious. One of the assistants may need to help me. May need to help me.
Eliot, it looks like you should be able to click on the PowerPoint icon on your doc.
this is it. Share. There we go. Whew. Okay,
Looks great.
very good. And now the top part is covering over where I need to get into. Can you see the button that is
Yeah, let me.
that says slideshow?
So
over
it's
here.
down in the bottom right-hand corner, next to where you would show the percentage of how zoomed in or out you are. It's right
on
next to the minus sign.
On my screen, this show slides is right over here somewhere. That's not good.
Let's see. Okay, Ellie, if you go to, I see your first slide here, and I can see your slide deck on the left-hand side.
There,
Go to the
okay.
up. Oh,
we're there.
Great.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, that cost a couple of minutes and we don't have a couple of minutes. So I apologize. Okay, whenever I do hear a voice, your picture will come up on the screen, and that'll be great. Okay, so we begin with a genius, right? The best book about Emily Dickinson, and is really the earliest biography by Richard Sewell. And one of the first sentences in it is, "Genius is ultimately unaccountable, and none more so than Emily Dickinson." Another word that can be applied to her, there are many. You can say she's a lyric poet, she's a metaphysical poet, she's a philosopher, she's a skeptic, she's a devotional poet, she's a feminist poet, she's an existential worrier, she's a playful Thoreauvian, she's a modernist, and so much more. My focus on her daughters is a result of a wonderful book by a friend of mine named Vivian Pollack. It's called Our Emily Dickinson's. I'll show it to you. Wonderful book. And what she does is to study the modernist poets who wrote about Emily Dickinson and also reflected her in their work. And the way they wrote about her really changed the way people thought about Dickinson. So they're very important people in their own right as poets, but also in the interpretations they give us of Emily Dickinson. So welcome to this story, first part of which is all about Emily. Of course, she was a poet during the Civil War, so there was much news, and fully 900 of her almost 1,800 poems came out of the Civil War, and she was connected to everybody who was important in her day, editors and politicians. And yet she said, famously, "The only news I know is bulletins all day from the position that interested her the most, from immortality." And she promised that she would tell us about it. And so we begin with the poems themselves, and just to say their first lines is to make you fall in love with Emily Dickinson, I hope, because they're just remarkable lines. Even the first lines are fantastic. They're just a sampling. "A word is dead when it is said, some say, I say it just begins to live that day." Very famous. "The nearest dream recedes unrealized" is a poem of frustration and anguish and longing. Everybody knows hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the tree, that does it. But also she wrote, "Hope is the subtle glutton." And a few others about hope that are not quite so great. She's a great transcriber of pain, better than anybody else I know. And one of the greatest of those poems is, "After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerve sits ceremonious," and goes on in that way. And she startles us with her imagery. One of the most startling poems, I think, "A toad can die of light," the beginning of a poem. And you go, what? What? Poet of meditations on marriage or not, mine by the right of the white election, of power and pride. It was given to me by the gods when I was a little girl. They love us most, that day. And in the end, the little girl goes off in triumph. My personal mantra, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, has theological ramifications in our daily life. A terrifying poem. My years had been from home, That is in your packet towards the end. They shut me up in prose, and this was a poet we're about to look at. At least to pray is left, her longing for spiritual life. I can wade grief, whole pools of it. Whoever says that? I can wade grief, whole pools of it, but the least touch of joy and I fall tipsy, she says. Everybody knows the soul selects her own majority, then shuts the door. Admit no more. Lovely sort of love poem. There came a day at summer's full, entirely for me, and so forth. Just amazing poems. And I wanted to put those out before we get into the weeds of her life and the lives of the people who were so influenced by her. Marianne Moore, Elizabeth Bishop, Adrienne Rich, Sylvia Plath, and her husband, Ted Hughes, and my friend, Tracy K. Smith, who was Poet Laureate. The story begins with these three children. And I suppose all of the English teachers and many people have seen this picture. It's a painting that shows Emily and her slightly older brother as looking almost identical. And indeed, they were very similar. They were confidants, they were competitors. She said, I've been in the practice of writing poetry, and I expect to make you proud one day. She said, she precedes that with Austin has been writing poetry. Their little sister Lavinia took the role of sort of Mary to Emily's Martha. She recognized from the very beginning that her sister was a genius, and she had to think, she had that to do, so that Lavinia, as the years went on, took on, or Benny as she's called, took on a lot of the household chores and management and so forth, and became a supporter of her sister. The three all had an important, the two siblings had a very important role to play in bringing Emily to us, as you will see. Their parents, as they were courting, were very, very clear that they wanted the children that they would have, be they boys or girls, to have a strong spiritual foundation, but also to have excellent educations. And indeed, both of them came, the Norcross family and the Dickinson family, all old families in America, were very strong in education, many teachers and principals and so forth in the family. As her father grew older and became the man that, to make up for the problems of his father, his father had started Amherst College and had lost a great deal of money, a lot of the family money. So Edward Dickinson was in a position where he really needed to get that back. He was very concerned about that. So he was a very successful lawyer. And much more than that, he held practically every sort of local and state office, and finally went to be in Washington as the representative for the Whig Party. The Republican Party was actually organized in his office in Washington. He had one term from 1854 to 1855, but it was a term that changed Emily Dickinson's life because she went to visit him. Her one trip outside of Massachusetts was with her family to go to Washington, where they did a lot of fun things and stayed in the Willard Hotel and had a grand time. Her mother, she dismissed sometimes, and so have scholars, but she was really remarkable too. And I will stand up for her. Emily lied. She lied a lot, by the way. One of the first poems in her packet is Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. Well, sometimes she just plain lied. And she did when she said, I never had a mother. I suppose a mother is one to whom you turn when you are in trouble. But she did have a mother who ran that household and those geniuses in it very, very well. And when she had her stroke, later in their life, you'll see it on the list of dates. It was a tragic thing for the family. And the two daughters had to pitch in, and Emily then wrote to the same friend she had lied to with great sorrow. She said, mine's meat by tunneling. And by the way, a lot of people on this have taken care of people and will take care of people. And I just think this is one of those heartbreaking letters. Mine's meat by tunneling when we were children and she journeyed. She always brought us something. Now, would she bring us but herself? What an only gift. So they cared for their mother for a number of years towards the end. she had a stroke the year after her father dropped dead in his office. It was a terrible, terrible blow to everybody. And Emily was so, so happy as she told the man to whom she lied, Higginson, I'm going to get to him, that she was so glad she came down and fixed breakfast for her father that day. So she wasn't with him when he died, but she was with him in the morning. And she was very, very close to him. She teased him. There's a school of thought that, she was afraid of him and he was very strict, and he looks that way. But he was terrific. At a great sunset, he went out and rang the bells in the church across the street to make everybody come out, because the bells meant there was a fire. So everybody came out, and what they did was they saw the sunset. He had that little streak in him, and more than a streak of fun, I think, that isn't shown in that picture. They didn't always live in this house. This is the one where if you go to the museum, this is the main part of it. But for a time, the family fortune, as I said, had been dissipated. So they had to rent a house nearby, and only about the time that Emily Dickinson was in Mount Holyoke did they move back into it. But most of the poems were written in this room up here, where she had a good vantage point, sometimes up in the cupola up there. And anybody can go through it, except right now it's closed for the COVID problem, but get your tickets now for when it opens. It's a wonderful place to visit. And you can go to her room. You can even, I think there's a way, sometimes is a money-raising thing where you can spend a night actually in her room. So as a child, of the first family, they founded Amherst College, and her father was the treasurer of it for 38 years. She had high visibility and a lot of friends, and this is one of her friends. There were a lot of very prominent families in this town. This is the woman who would become Helen Hunt Jackson. There's a page on her after the Emily Dickinson pages that you're on now, if you're on that page, if you're in that packet. She was pretty amazing. She and Emily were born the same year. Both of them were very strong-minded. Both of them had resistance to the hegemony, especially the church, and were very mischievous. In fact, Helen was so mischievous, she was sent away. So she did not go to Amherst Academy, which was her loss, because this plain building gave Emily the equivalent really of a college education, because the great scholars, I see that there is stuff covering up some of their names, but I don't know if that's on your screen. But the leaders in sciences at the college were her teachers in the Amherst Academy, which was her pre-Mount Holyoke education. And they were quite remarkable. She practiced writing constantly. Later on, Mabel Loomis Todd, we'll meet her in a moment, described her compositions as strikingly original in both thought and style. And we would do anything to have those compositions from her school days. Or a little, they put out a magazine called Fern Leaves, sort of, leaves of grass. So this was Fern Leaves. We don't have any of them. And look in your attics, please, everybody, and see if anything is there. She said, I expect I shall be everybody knows this line because of the play. And indeed, she was quite a little social butterfly in the early years. She had many girlfriends. She wrote them long, funny letters. Garrison Keillor, who read them at an event in Amherst to raise money. And by the way, that's a whole story, but he said she should be a stand-up comedian. If you just read those early letters to her friends, there are also some anguish in them, especially about religion. She's very funny, very chatty. And if you think I'm talking fast, those letters show somebody who never stopped talking and just had a great time with language. And she had boyfriends who took her out driving and so forth. She was perfectly normal. She went to Mount Holyoke. Another friend who's written a wonderful book, brand new book about 10 fevered days. She didn't know how great the title would be for COVID days, 10 fevered days in the life of Emily Dickinson. But she organized this conference in 1999 at Mount Holyoke, where we learned, because she has all the great knowledge of Mount Holyoke about Emily's time there. The place was run so tightly. It was a very, very disciplined organization. And it was all under the watchful eye. By the way, she had a great sense of humor. I don't know if you can read that. She wasn't really struggling to get out. She really loved it. She loved every course and many of the teachers, but she was under the watchful eye of this remarkable woman, one of the great female educators. I'm sure you've heard of her. She's important enough to warrant a stamp. And my friend, Martha Ackman, has done a lot of reading in the letters of classmates of Emily Dickinson. So we get a very full picture of Mary Lyon and how she was. As some people kept their children from going to that school because they thought that she encouraged students to enact the manly part and to be too ambitious. But others, like the Dickinsons, believed in Lyon's drive to urge young women to accomplish great things, and they did. One went to work among the Choctaw Indians. One of Emily's dearest friends, Beirut, founded AUB, American University in Beirut in Lebanon, with her husband, her minister husband. Students described Mary Lyon as being all over the place. She ran the school, but she was up at 5 in her wrapper to check on breakfast. She shepherded them where they should be. There was no standing still. She was after them to be every place, dressing as well as an old washerwoman. Yet she is noble for doing business. This is a student's memory. She runs around here with her nose dripping and does more than any two men. Emily saw her as driven, and yes, she had her confrontations because the intellectual side of Mary Lyon that Emily accepted was at war with Mary Lyon's insistence that girls stand up and testify to their salvation, which Emily refused to do. She wouldn't heave into her mouth, as Cordelia said, something she couldn't truly attest to. And so she told her friend in one of the letters, I am standing alone in rebellion. I both believe and disbelieve 100 times an hour. But she also recorded Mary Lyon's do the difficult. Great minds take in a great deal. Do something, have a plan, live for a purpose. And that's exactly what she did when she went back to the homestead with these two people on her wall. She became, just a factory for poems, so prodigious. She was deeply influenced by Barrett Browning, whose Aurora Leigh is a whole big epic of a woman writer in the 19th century. And in fact, so much so that one scholar has claimed that she was actually plagiarizing from it. Their borrowings are so great. George Eliot, she loved from the very earliest of Eliot's books when she still thought George Eliot was a man. And later, when Middlemarch was published, you can see what she said. What do I think about Middlemarch? What do I think about glory? I wrote a whole article on that line and George Eliot and Emily Dickinson. She also wrote the poems and many, many, many letters. I'm going to pause on these because everybody does. It's part of the legend, and we have to say it. There are 3 of these master letters, so-called master letters. I don't know if you can see very clearly. You can't really, but you can see at least a little that they're all scratched out. They're drafts of letters. We don't know if they were ever sent or to whom they were sent. They could have been part of an epistolary novel. They sound a little bit like Jane Eyre in parts. They are highly, highly erotic. Nobody can say they are not erotic, very erotic. And so the question is, were they sent to a man, or some people say to a woman even? If to a man, this is one of the prize candidates. There were about 4 or 5. This is probably the most likely. On that trip to Washington that she made in 1858 to see her father, she went by way of Philadephia, where she went with cousins to a church where a man who was also praised by Mark Twain as being very witty and eloquent and a terrific Presbyterian minister, and has whole articles published on him and his eloquence. She loved words. She heard him, and she was apparently having this spiritual crisis herself. She started a dialogue with him that lasted even after he, and this is a big clue, I think, to why I think he could be a possibility, even after he took his family to California. He took a church in California at some point. and in San Francisco, where much is written about him. Another candidate is this man, younger than Wadsworth. He had the run of the family. He became a good friend of Austin's. The Springfield Republican had the highest circulation of any paper outside of Boston, and it was second only to one of the Boston papers. It was a very, it's sometimes liberal paper, sometimes not. And he's very, very charming, and she fell in love with him, says Sewell. I don't know about that, but a Washingtonian, Judith Farr, a friend of mine and a great scholar, believes this could be the candidate because many of the erotic poems and letters are reference Eden, certainly Wild Nights does, and this man vacationed in a place called Eden, Maine. So there's a clue. Who knows? But he did one sort of terrible thing. She was writing privately and sending poems across the hedge to her friend, Austin's wife, about whom you'll hear in a moment. And probably Sue sent a couple of poems to him, and he printed one. It's in your packet, and you can look at it later. It's great fun, but she did not ever title anything. And so a lot of her poems were riddles. And this one is not titled. And you have to figure it out for yourself. I'm looking for the number of it in your packet, but it is there. And the answer to it is that it's a snake. Well, he put a title on it, so there wasn't any fun in the riddle anymore. It is fun if you're a teacher to give the poem without the title to students and see what they do with it. And it takes them a while to get there. We know that the master is not this man because she was writing the letters this time earlier in her life. She did know Judge Lord, her father's friend, closer in her age to her father than to her, and his wife. But when Mary Lord died, they became true, I would say, lovers. They wrote the sweetest letters to each other and were all but they really were engaged, but I don't think anybody thinks they would ever have married. They were, too ensconced in their individual lives, but their letters, that makes it more special because we have these lovely letters. One of them written when she was actually in bed thinking about him. I mean, it's just a lovely, lovely, sweet romance, but he's not the master. It's also not this man, but this man deserves so much conversation from us. He is one of the great people in Emily Dickinson's lives, and he's one of the great makers of Emily Dickinson's daughters as well. He, before he did the thing that would change Emily's life, which was to put an article in the Atlantic with advice to young writers, and she wrote back to him in 1862, very famous letter, "Are you too deeply occupied, blah, blah." He had already been a hero. The ironic thing is that he was fantastic in his own day, and now we know him primarily as Emily Dickinson's preceptor, a term she put on him, sort of teacher. He was a radical, he was a Unitarian minister, but he left the church, congregational minister. He left the church, they kicked him out actually, because he got involved in these radical things. That during the fugitive slave law, people were imprisoned for helping other people to escape. And he really had quite a career with other people. He had a project to get a man named Anthony Sims out of jail. He took a bunch of axes to get another man freed. Made quite he was part of rabbles. Who, I mean, what we had at the Capitol was sort of what that looked like to other people. They were really trying to free these people who were unfairly bound in jail. And he had other causes too that he was involved in. By 1862, he was a regular contributor and part-time editor of the Atlantic, and he wrote a wonderful long editorial asking for more writers, especially women writers, and he said, you should make your poetry live. And so Emily Dickinson, the same week that appeared, wrote him back with this very bold letter. Are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? Live, breathe, alive. That's what she wanted. She wanted his affirmation. And they began a correspondence that was for the rest of her life. He saved 71 of those letters and 102 of those poems. There were probably others. He never really encouraged her overtly, and there's much discussion about that, but they kept writing. And he finally read a Bronte poem at her funeral. She predeceased him, and he will come into the story later. To him, she described herself in one of her first letters, very famous description. She lied. She wasn't especially plain. She wasn't a midget. She was a size probably 1 or 0, but she wasn't abnormally small. But her hair was bold like the chestnut. The only other physical description we have of her is from someone I'm about to tell you about, who saw her only in her coffin at 56 when her hair was still chestnut and her skin at that time unlined. A little while after they started their conversations, he decided to enlist. These were the war years, and he did a very brave thing because he was not young at the time. He had his training with the 51st New England Regiment, and then he went to be the commander of the 1st Carolina Platoon, which was the first entirely Black regiment, the first, and I mean first, because Gould's was 14 months later, the one in Glory. That came later. Higginson didn't die. He did get malaria, and he had to leave without too long a service. But it was a very, very frightening time for Emily Dickinson when she thought she had lost her preceptor and he was out of touch and so forth. And the book that he wrote about it as he recovered from his illness is really a wonderful little book. A number of people I know have read it just in itself without even Emily in mind and loved it. Well, the war years were terrible years, of course. They lost many people in Amherst, including her dear friend, T.S. Thomas Stearns Eliot. One of his relatives was one of the family close friends. One of her most beautiful poems, When I Was Small, a Woman Died. Today, her only son died in scarlet. Maryland was probably about Fraser's death, but there were many deaths. She also was very worried about her eyes, that she was going blind. And so she spent some time in Boston in a rooming house with patches on her eyes, not able to read or do anything. Very difficult time. And then, of course, the troubles piled up. Her father died, her mother's stroke. And the worst one practically was her little nephew. Her sister Sue and Austin had married her best friend. They had 3 children. You'll meet another one in a minute. But her favorite was the little boy, who came much later than his 2 siblings. He was her pal. And when he died, hard on the heels of the parents, it was a crushing blow, and it was just before her own death. These toys were piled up in a house, the house next door to the homestead, which is now part of the museum. And we were able, before it became part of the museum, to actually see them in this state, left as they were when little Gibb died in 1882, heartbreakingly. And some of her loveliest poems were about him. Another thing that was happening during that last period was that she was being begged to publish. This is the person who was begging her to publish. Remember her, the little naughty girl who was born the same year she was, grew up to have quite a career and a lot of sadness, but quite a career. She married a captain in the Army and had 2 children. And then her first child died. Her husband suffocated mysteriously in an Army maneuver of some kind. And right after that, or 2 years after that, the other son died. So she was childless. She moved to Newport. She met many literary figures, and boy, did she go to town. There's a page in your packet about Helen Hunt Jackson, as she came to be known. And you can see that her career was fantastic. This doesn't begin to cover it. She wrote a novel called Mercy Philbrick's Choice, which probably Emily Dickinson herself is one of the figures in it. The most amazing thing she did was, on a very bad leg, in very poor health, she became very interested in Native Americans, and she wrote an incredible sort of encyclopedia of troubles that various tribes had had. I read it at the Library of Congress, and it is a magnificent. It did not do what she wanted, which to bring sympathy to the tribes. So she wrote a novel which brought to life those people, certain of them, and it's very like Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's been compared to it. I think it's almost better in some ways. People in California know it very well because there's a Ramona pageant every year. But she was something. And the reason I did this here is because one of the problems Emily Dickinson had towards the end of her life was that she was being nagged by Helen Hunt Jackson to send her poems, to let her be the executive. It is wrong of you. Well, Helen Hunt probably had already stolen a few poems. Emily Dickinson did send her some, and she published one of them, Success is Counted Sweetest. She published it anonymously without Emily's permission, but she did believe in Emily. But what Emily thought went to the grave with her. She died of Bright's disease. That's one candidate for the illness. Many doctors have tried to figure out what might have happened, but probably that. You die a peaceful death. And on those of you, I think it was 5 or 6 people raised their hand. You know, this is in the backyard of Emily Dickinson's house. She was taken around by the Irish servants to be buried in the backyard. And the last 2 words she wrote to her friends, the Norcross cousins, whether they were a poem or a letter, we don't know. Just 2 words called back are on the grave. And whether she wanted to be published or not went with her. But a lot of people have studied what happened afterwards. I've mentioned Martha's book. And another very good new one is how these other daughters of Dickinson brought her to us. And this is a remarkable story. The story of Dickinson is rather calm, but this story gets very interesting. We know that she said, "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me," you know, the famous poem. And it ends, "For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me." And we know that the country has judged her tenderly, even making a stamp of her and, you know, having festivals around the country and marathons in the Library of Congress and so forth. That I helped to do. It's just wonderful. We know the country paid attention. But she also said very sharply, when she said no to Helen Hunt Jackson and no to other people, other editors who came to see her, publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty, if I were poor, would be justifying for so foul a thing. And, you know, possibly I could publish, but we would rather from our garret go white unto the white creator and invest our snow. She had great qualms about what would happen at publication. Nevertheless, she instructed her sister to burn the letters that she had received. Terrible that her sister did that. As far as we know, unless Vinnie lied, Lavinia, the executrix, she did not say to burn the poems. And so a chest was stuffed full of things that even surprised Vinnie. She had shared a room with her sister. She bought the ink and the paper and everything for the house. And still she was astonished that here were these, you know, when they came to be numbered, almost 1,800 extant poems, 1,300 extant letters. Those came later, of course. And these things, these packets that would be called fascicles, she did not call them, we don't know what she called them. And they're the most interesting thing because that seemed to be an editing project in itself. And that has become a rather divisive subject. So you can see these reproduced in 2 huge fat, that's about 5 inches across, that's a huge book, a doorstopper. There are 2 of them, and those are the transcriptions of the fascicles, the little books. I made little fascicles myself and took them to the Library of Congress to do my research later on. They were finally recently put into print by Chris Miller, but it's not the same as reading them this way. And some of us feel very strongly that we should read Emily Dickinson through those fascicles and not sort of willy-nilly the way the packet of poems is that I gave you. Now, if you look at your packet of poems, which is the big packet, number 2, you will see that there are 2 poems on the first page opposite each other. And here they are in the fascicle. And I'm going to show you, I'm not going to have you read these at this point, but I'm going to show you what happens when you put 2 poems that when you read them separately are fine poems, but when you read them in their fascicle setting, these little books, these little books had 19 to 22 poems each. She stabbed them with something like the kind of rope you put around your roast beef to twine, really. It was a great thrill to see that. It wasn't what I imagined when I first saw these. And when you see that and you see what she did by putting poems next to each other in succeeding pages, you can't not believe that she wasn't very conscious of what she was doing. And here she is doing this absolutely astonishing thing. So on the left, she has the poem that I've numbered just willy-nilly as number 3. By the way, the numbers at the bottom of the poems, that FR stands for the Franklin number. He numbered them chronologically because he's the editor of the current Variorum, and he also was the one who recovered the fascicles for us. And so that's the number in the chronological ordering of the poems. The F number, it refers to the number of fascicle it is. So this is in the middle of her fascicle project, fascicle 21. In the middle of a fascicle, she puts these 2 poems, which I think are her aesthetic statement to us. On the left, you have, they shut me up in prose as when a little girl, they put me in the closet because they like me still. A little, that feisty little girl. Prose would be the opposite of poetry, of course, the daily world. Still, could themselves have peeped and seen my brain go round, they might as wise have lodged a bird for treason in the pound. A pound could also be a prison. Himself, the bird, has but to will, and easy as a star look down upon captivity, no more have I. It's a fine poem in itself. But there's this one over here. And when you read them side by side, something amazing happens. Because what is a poet in this Emersonian language? Pure Emerson, Emerson's essay on the poet. Emerson had, by the way, gone to Sue and Austin's house to do a reading. She says, this was a poet. It is that, a genderless creature, of course, distills, opposite the word, they like me still. So you can put a hyphen in there and play with that. And you can say that a poet not only makes something economical out of a huge quantity of something, puts something in the smallest, puts the most complex term in the most amazingly succinct way, but also unsettles us, makes us uncomfortable, destills us in some ways, makes us squirm. And he does that from Otter Soemens, the whole world is his materials, from the familiar species that perished by the door. And we remember that there is a door in the other poem. We wonder it was not ourselves arrested it before, right opposite a pound where that bird is imprisoned. So she's having fun with us across the pages as well as down the page. And then she speaks for the imagination because we are poor by contrast. In Emerson's language, we are the owners, poets are the owners of all land, tax-free, and we are poor by contrast to them. Well, Vinnie discovered all these poems and she took them to the person. Vinnie decided that they should be out in the world. So she took them to the person who was the most logical person to take them to. I didn't ask you to raise your hands if you'd seen any of the movies, the 2 rather dreadful movies, one with Cynthia Nixon and one with Molly Shannon, or if you've seen, I haven't seen the new Apple production. I didn't see, I'm going to ask, I guess, when we all come up again to see how many of you have. But this is Sue. who figures very prominently in those movies and has been made much of by a particular, group of Dickinsonians, including one of my mentors who's writing a book about her. And she was Emily's girlhood friend. Emily sent more of the poems to her than to anybody else. There are 500 items, poems and notes and things in Sue's possession. So it was logical for Vinnie to take them there. And Sue did nothing. She sat on them for 2 years. And then Vinnie went back in the dark of night. And here's where the story gets very sexy. She took them to another woman who had been in and out of the Dickinson house. This very beautiful woman who was the wife of the astronomy professor. She came late in the day to the Amherst household when Sue and Austin's children were teenagers. And she fit right in. She was young and she had a good time. And she got to be very friendly with Austin. And they had an affair that was no secret in the community, especially when he willed her land, which was contested by his sisters and got to be a big mess. But even before that time, after his death, it was well known in the community. Well, Mabel Loomis Todd was just a remarkable woman, leaving aside that her choice of a person to have an affair with, the major person in all of the community, an affair which her husband seemed to look on almost with approval. They conducted this in the house that Emily lived in with Vinnie, if you can imagine. So she had already been in the house. She had never seen Emily Dickinson because Emily was always upstairs. And so Mabel played the piano. Mabel had a great education. She came from Washington, D.C., and had been educated at Georgetown, which is essentially a prep school for Georgetown. And then she'd gone to the Smith Conservatory for Music. No, the New England Conservatory for Music. And she was an excellent musician. She was an artist. She was just remarkable. And later in the story, as an older woman, she climbed Mount Fuji with her husband, which required 21 miles of walking up a mountain, in who knows what garments of the day. She was just an amazing, amazing woman. And she devoted the rest of her life really to, she bought a typewriter. A lot of us had in a conference saw that typewriter. You kill your fingers typing on it. And she set about transcribing things that look like this, imagine, into print that looks more or less like the packets look. So that was a hard job. She didn't have a big name and she knew it needed that. So guess who she turned to? He had begged Emily Dickinson also to print, but he had never really encouraged her. He had encouraged Helen Hunt Jackson, but not Emily Dickinson. And but when this beautiful lady came calling, he said, "Oh, okay, we'll do this together." She also got her daughter, Millicent, another remarkable one of Dickinson's daughters, if you will, educated at Vassar Phi Beta Kappa. And then she was one of the first females, I think she may have been the first, to get a PhD at Harvard in geology. She was a scientist like her father. She was fluent in French. And during World War I, that she went to France. She's just a remarkable person, but she became her mother's assistant in all of this. And they grew kind of old together. Millicent ended up living in Washington, D.C., and very interesting, fascinating woman. By the way, I think I left out of the story that Mabel was such a great musician that in addition to playing the piano for Emily, Emily was also a great musician, played the piano and even composed. But Mabel played the organ well enough to give a concert that raised enough money for a new organ at the Episcopal Church. The drawing on the cover of the first productions that they made was a drawing of Mabel's. And you see that in quick succession, after they started this, they started publishing. And Thomas Wentworth Higginson, whose name was on the first two, although he did very little, his were the judgments, maybe Wild Nights shouldn't be in, it's a little shocking. And he helped to regularize and do terrible things to the poems. But the main work was done by the woman, right? And so he was just the sort of almost advisor, but his name was on the first two. And you see that it was not on, even though he was very much alive, for the last ones, and that Austen died sort of in the middle, and the whole suit became public knowledge. And Emily Dickinson became a kind of myth because Mabel Loomis Todd was given by Vinnie about $400 for the publication, not much. And by the time Austen died and the scandal broke, they were on the outs. So Mabel's benefit was in becoming a lecturer and in telling the story of Emily Dickinson with the book. And the story she told was one, of a woman she had not really met. But it was a great story. And from her, we get the myth of the unfortunate love affair and the woman secluded and no friends and things that are in part myth. Well, Suze is watching all this, and you can imagine the way she feels. She was Emily's dearest friend. So she got her daughter, another daughter of Dickinson. And this woman, whoa, what a character. She was in the art scene in New York. She had a musical education. She's the one who went to the Smith College of Music, I think. And she was in Europe in the art scene, and she married this no count count. The marriage lasted 5 years, but it was enough to allow her to be a countess. He turned out to be a horrible fraud, but she became the writer of some of the best books on Emily Dickinson, so I can't knock her too much. One of them is Emily Dickinson Face to Face, which was a sharp elbow into the work of Millicent, you remember her, who wrote a book called Ancestors Brocades it was a sort of biography with letters. So the two houses now are warring over Emily Dickinson, and it's kind of a mess. Martha enlists the help of a friend of hers in the art scene who comes to live with her. It's not a romantic connection. He was much younger, but he came to help her edit. And he is important to the story because he becomes the executor of the estate, the poems. And it is he who sells the poems that eventually go to the Harvard Houghton Museum, where those of us who work on Dickinson must pay Harvard University to use a poem of Emily Dickinson's or a letter. Harvard owns them. And it's because of this man who married a woman younger than himself, who lived in the house. Remember I showed you the toys? She lived in the house until the 80s, and everybody wanted her to die, wanted the house to be free. And finally she died and the house became part of the museum. But he was given even the house, and he, with instructions to raze it, R-A-Z-E. And fortunately that didn't happen. It's part of the museum. So we have this industry of Dickinson, the poems. You see in 1955, important year for the other people whom we're going to meet. We know that Emily Dickinson was right to worry because there's schlock out there about Emily Dickinson. A whole industry of greeting cards. There's even a Foot Locker card there if you see quoting Emily Dickinson. There's a lot of junk and some good stuff too. A friend in our class, Judy Gunkler, everybody in our class just sent me today a little thing about using Emily Dickinson in Lent, which is kind of astonishing given her skepticism. But she became the subject of murder mysteries, really good ones, of children's books, and of course the hundreds of scholarly materials, some of which are in the bibliography I gave you. And in art, in drama, and music, hundreds and hundreds of settings, primarily, most famously, the Copeland, but many, many others. And even sculpture, this fantastic exhibit, that's a more than life-size dress in plaster with lines of Dickinson, was at the Women's Museum in Washington not too many years ago. Remarkable work by Leslie Dill, even making it into the New Yorker and other, comic forms, and the movies that I cited and so forth. So it's not surprising that she began to acquire these other daughters. And this is the first of them that I'll talk about, although there certainly were others like Edna St. Vincent Millay and so forth before. Marianne Moore, as you saw in that one pager, now we're going to that third packet, which is the contemporary poets packet. And of course, I'm not going to go over everything, but you will need it because we're going to now move between the two packets, the packet of the modern poems and the packet of Emily Dickinson poems, to show you just how much these people are indebted and why. And we'll begin with Marianne Moore. Actually, she had a brother and a sister, as Emily Dickinson did, and a very powerful mother, but no father. Her father left almost at birth, and that was a sadness. Her mother very dominating. By the time she got to this stage in Greenwich Village, free a little bit, she had done some very worthy things, teaching Indians in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, for example, including a famous baseball player. You know, she had quite a career, and she became the editor of the Dial. She also became a great collector of odd things, and this shows you one of them. Now, if you turn the pages at the page after the biography of Emily Dickinson, there's a poem based on this drawing, and I'm going to ask two of you to tell the powers that be there and I really want you to be bold, raise your hand so that they see you, because I need two people to read, okay? Because you're tired of me and I have to take a drink. And I want these to be in your voices. So whom do we have to read the jellyfish poem? Do we have a Kathleen? Do we have a taker?
Looks like Edie is willing to volunteer. So let's, Edie, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes,
There you go.
I have.
Good. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Just go ahead and read a jellyfish.
Okay. A jellyfish. Visible, invisible, a fluctuating charm. An amber-colored amethyst inhabits it. Your arm approaches, and it opens and it closes. You have meant to catch it, and it shrivels. You abandon your intent. It opens, and it closes, and you closes, and you.
And then reach for it, it goes over.
Reach for it, the blue surrounding it grows cloudy, and it floats away from you.
Okay, before we see what she did with the jellyfish, she did something with so many diverse creatures and things, pieces of porcelain and so forth. But before we go there, we're going to go to Emily Dickinson, and in the packet of poems, we're going to number 19. Do we have a volunteer to read that one?
Okay, Sally.
Sally, wonderful. Sally, it's going to be so good to see you.
You should be able to unmute yourself.
Sally's an actress, among other things, as I guess you know. She is a legend at Wooster. She's responsible for whole buildings. Where is she?
We're having a little trouble hearing you, Sally. I see that you're unmuted, but I can't hear you.
Oh, we can't hear Sally?
No, I don't believe so.
That's too bad. Is there somebody else? Sally, I'll see you later. There's somebody else who wants to read this one? We don't have too much time. Well, please people be bold, because I'm going to ask it again, because I think we need different voices here. But I'll do this one since people are a little bit timid maybe. Oh, there's somebody.
Oh, it looks like Clint. Okay. There you
Okay,
go, Clint. You should be able to
that's good.
unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Okay, number 19, right?
Yes.
The spider holds a silver ball in unperceived hands, and dancing slowly to himself, his yarn of pearl unwinds. He plies from knot to knot in unsubstantial trade, supplants our tapestries with his, in half the period, an hour to rear supreme his continents of light, then dangle from the housewife's broom his boundaries forgot.
Thank you. Thank you both for reading those. So we have two poems that are about creatures that we don't like to think about. They're icky. And we have two uses of them by two poets. Now, I should say that Marianne Moore's way to really know how much she loved Dickinson, it started, of course, in Bryn Mawr. By the way, all the 7 sister schools get into this talk. Everybody went to one of them. She went to Bryn Mawr, and of course, she read the old Emily Dickinson, in a very regular Emily Dickinson there. But then in 1931, she was asked to do a review of Mabel Loomis's Todd version of the letters. And she did that and worked very hard on it, and came out with a Dickinson that was a complete surprise to her. What she gave us was Emily Dickinson, who's completely normal, not strange, not with a strange love affair and stuck in a room, but someone who was funny and out in the world and knew people and was a citizen of the world. So she wrote her review with kind of that surprise, and in her poems too, we see the influence of Emily Dickinson, I think, even here, because if we read them in reverse order, but here we have two poems which are about these creatures we don't like to think about, but they're really both about, if you think about them, they're both really not about that, because Marianne Moore made a distinction. The bottom of the page under jellyfish is the beginning of a poem about poetry. It goes on to the next page, the whole page, and makes a distinction between the raw material of poetry, that would be the jellyfish, and that which is genuine, which would be what it suggests and what the poet conveys that it suggests. And so what does this suggest? That is, visible and invisible, has a fluctuating charm. It draws us in, but we can't quite get it. It is quite beautiful. Just when you think it has it, you have it, and you try to snatch it, it quivers. Well, what that obviously is a poem that we cannot pin down. It is so difficult. And similarly, the spider holds a silver ball. Yes, it's amazing to watch a spider. It does that magic thing that creates that beauty out of what? Out of nothing. There's nothing there. And somehow, as Emily puts it in many poems about spiders, this is not the only one, this creature goes from knot to knot and weaves this pattern, and it's beautiful. It can charm us, or it can also disappear, and that's a very frightening thing for her. But you see Marianne Moore as one of the early, proponents of Emily Dickinson, so that when she got so famous at the end of her life as to throw out the ball at the Brooklyn Dodgers and cheer for them and be on the cover of Life magazine and have Nixon say she was a great poet and be buddies with Muhammad Ali and other Black leaders, and just be an amazing old woman. It's pretty amazing for her and for Emily Dickinson, because she had been writing about Emily Dickinson. She was very good to Elizabeth Bishop. Elizabeth Bishop also lost her father almost immediately at birth, and when she was this old, her mother was put in an institution. And she saw her once after that time, but it's a very tragic story about her early life. And so if you move in your packet of material on the modern poets to page 5, and actually we're going to move to page 6 first, to the Sestina. She was given to relatives, to her grandparents and to other relatives, one of whom lived in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, very poor area. And it was a time of cold and suffering and, loneliness, terrible loneliness, which she remembered later when she got to be older and was traveling around the world. This experience of this little girl with her grandmother became fodder for this absolutely gorgeous poem, which I think in the interest of time, we won't say who can read this. I'll abandon that idea because people didn't volunteer fast enough and we couldn't hear Sally. So I'll go ahead, if you don't mind, and just be the reader. Looking back on that time, she wrote this absolutely gorgeous sestina, which is a very tricky form. If you look at it, the last line, the last word of it doesn't rhyme, but the last word of the first stanza becomes the last word of the second stanza, and so on throughout. So they're linked, kind of almost a charm bracelet of verses, and they're all musical based on rhythm rather than strict metricality. And this sestina is a picture, she draws a narrative picture of an old woman and her granddaughter in a very poor house. September rain fall on the house. In the failing light, the old grandmother sits in the kitchen with the child beside the little marble stove, reading the jokes from the almanac, laughing and talking to hide her tears. She thinks that her equinoctial tears and the rain that beats on the roof of the house were both foretold in the almanac, but only known to a grandmother. The iron kettle sings on the stove. She cuts some bread and says to the child, and it goes on like that. This is a gorgeous poem that I encourage you to read out loud because it is just so absolutely beautiful. And if you turn to number 22 in the Emily Dickinson poems, you'll see another poem. Even the English teachers among you, I think, don't know this. Very few people know this poem. It's a narrative. It's not a lyric poem, as most of hers are. But I believe that Elizabeth Bishop did know this poem because here's a poem. I know some lonely houses off the road, a Robert like the look of, wooden barred and windows hanging low, inviting to a portico where two could creep, one hand the tools, the other peep. And it's about two robbers sneaking up on what? A grandmother in this poor little isolated house off the road. And it's a wonderful little story, a tender story. I think the tenderness of it is picked up by Elizabeth Bishop, who had, before she wrote this poem, come to Emily Dickinson by way of Marianne Moore. And if you turn back a page to page 5 on the packet on the poets, you'll see her invitation to Miss Marianne Moore, which is really funny. It's a lovely poem. It's a very famous poem, an incantation, From Brooklyn Bridge, over the Brooklyn Bridge in this fine morning, please come flying in a cloud of fiery, pale chemicals. Please come flying, lots of action. An incantation to this witch, the one in the tri-colored hat with the sparkly shoes, to come flying back. They were great friends, Elizabeth Bishop and Marianne Moore, and she loved her. And of course, she would lose her as she would lose other people in her life, like the man she fell in love with at first glance, Robert Lowell. Their friendship was just an amazing friendship, so much that there's a big fat book of letters that made a big splash a few years ago, just the two people saying wonderful things about other poets and each other's, and he would die. She would have a lot of losses in her life. And the most famous poem about losses is the one she wrote about loss. It's a villanelle, and I screwed it up when I put it in your packet, one art. So I'm going to read it to you, and you may weep. Villanelle is very complicated, as you see. Some of you know Do Not Go Gentle Into That Night, Good Night, for example, by Dylan Thomas. They are sort of games, but it's one thing to have a game, and it's another thing to have a game that makes you weep at the end. So this is what she says. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch. I left that out of it. And look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones. She traveled all over. 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them. But it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture of love, I shan't have lied. It's evident. The art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. Well, this poem is so obviously like Emily Dickinson's many versions of stories of loss. You see one on the page we've just been on about the lonely houses, number 24. I lost a world the other day. Has anybody found? You'll know it by the row of stars around its forehead bound. Something great has been, or longing is the seed. Just poem after poem by Emily Dickinson about her losses. And like the other daughter, Marianne Moore, Elizabeth Bishop came to Emily Dickinson through letters. In 1931, Elizabeth Bishop had reviewed the book of letters that was done by Millicent. But in 1951, Elizabeth Bishop was given the job of reviewing a book of letters to the Holland family from Emily Dickinson. The daughter in that family, Elizabeth, was just a startlingly wonderful woman. And some of the letters in the collection that Elizabeth Bishop was looking at and reviewing were quite amorous. And Elizabeth Bishop, who was herself a lesbian and had lost her partner, Lotta, whom she lived with in a Brazilian period of her life, was very sensitive about this because it was not open. So she was struggling to sort of hide that fact about Emily Dickinson, but it brought her to Emily Dickinson in a way that was, I think, very real. That was the 50s when people were not out in the open. And so her coming was, delicate. Adrienne Rich, however, enters the scene in a different time of feminism and a fierce form of feminism, of course. Adrienne Rich, possibly some of you saw her live doing readings. She's been around a lot. She began life as every other proper young girl when she was growing up with her doctor father, who was quite a tyrant, and her mother, who submitted to him and to her children. She married a professor. She felt smothered. She had 3 little boys, boom, boom, boom. She was struggling to write. She did win the Bollinger Prize before she had really started full time, when she still felt smothered in her household. And then her husband, after she divorced him, went up on a hill not far from their home and shot himself. And of course, the shock of that and the terror of that led her into quite a transformation of herself until she became the Adrienne Rich most of us know in this feminist phase. And she became kind of the godmother of a lot of modern poets in her self-creation mode. And she also had a partner, a woman partner, for many years towards the end of her life. And what she created was another Emily Dickinson, a whole other one, and a whole other way of women to write. One of her most famous poems, I Wish We Could Do, Diving into the Wreck, has been called by none less than Helen Bendler, if you know her name, as just an astonishing miracle. It talks, the figure in the poem, the speaker in the poem, goes down as a deep sea diver, digging for herself, essentially among the weeds. and the imagery in it is incredible. She also gave a very important speech for feminist writers, but her most important Dickinson contribution is that she wrote an important essay called Vesuvius at Home, where she redesigned Emily Dickinson for us. This daughter gave us a different Dickinson. She said that Dickinson often felt herself possessed by a demonic force, particularly in the 60s when she was writing at the height of her drive. I suggested a woman's poetry about her relationship to her daemon, her own active, creative power, has in patriarchal culture used the language of heterosexual love or patriarchal theology. She pointed to the very many poems that Emily Dickinson wrote that concern volcanoes, and she sees that as the woman poet, you know, the pent up explosive power that might come out. It might be a thing of beauty, or it might kill people. It might distill them. It might completely interrupt their lives. It might do something terrible. It has a terrible power. And that is what Adrienne Rich's Dickinson did. She became a real student of Dickinson and gave us a whole new Dickinson. And that Dickinson, the explosive Dickinson, in all of these volcano poems, there are a couple in your packet. There's one particularly that is rather wonderful, and it is number 34, towards the end of the packet, that we might just look at for a moment. Show that this is her, Emily Dickinson, a still volcano life that flickered in the night. Oh no, that's the one I messed up. I've never seen volcanoes, but when travelers tell, this is number 34, when those old phlegmatic mountains, usually so still, bear within appalling ordnance, fire and smoke and gun, taking villages for breakfast and appalling men. If the stillness is volcanic in the human face, then upon a pane titanic, features keep their place. If the stillness is volcanic, oh, I see what I did. If at length the smoldering anguish will not overcome, and the palpitating you see an appalling, pal, vineyard in the dust be thrown, and so forth. That notion of pain being conquered, being at least contained. If you turn the page, you will see some other instances where she talks about that. I can wait grief, whole pools of it, number 39, but the least push of joy breaks up my feet, and I tip drunken. She says, power is only pain, stranded through discipline, till weights will hang. Give bomb to giants, and they'll wilt like men. Give Himalaya, the highest, heaviest mountain, they'll carry him. She also, if you go to the next page, a wounded deer leaps highest, there's the notion of what wounds you also gives you power. And in that poem, A Wounded Deer Leaps Highest, she has the third stanza, mirth is the mail of anguish. Mirth is the mail of anguish. Consider that mail as armor, in which a cautious arm, lest anybody spy the blood in your hurt. So she's giving us, this daughter of Dickinson is giving us this explosive Emily Dickinson. And if she was explosive, well, look at this. Now we have the real anger. Now we have the true explosion, which looks pretty placid in this picture when Sylvia Plath, who had by this time, after her Smith years and other seven sisters, forgive me, Wooster, but there are a lot of seven sisters in this story. She had gone to England on a Fulbright and met the man who would become the poet laureate of England, and very famous and very controversial. And she was deeply in love. She had already tried to commit suicide, as we know from the Bell Jar, where she describes it quite vividly. She has a character in the Bell Jar, by the way, named Ellie Higginbotham. What are the chances of that? Spelled differently, both the Ellie and the Higginbotham, but it's in there. It's on page 70 or something. It's hysterical to find it there. And so anyway, she comes to England already sick, but healing and writing tremendously. You can see this happy marriage. You can see on the right, there already beginning to be some second thoughts. And by the time she is very happy to have 2 children, and it tries to be a good mother, but is suffering because her husband is leaving her. She's too possessive. These 2 children Frida grows up to be a designer and to edit her mother's work. She's out there in the world today, quite a wonderful woman. The little boy, I'm sorry to say, committed suicide when he grew to adulthood. He followed his mother's illness, I guess. But before she did that, she gave us some absolutely astonishing poems. And we read them not just because Sylvia Plath is famous for having finally tucked the children in and put the cloth under the doors and written a note to the babysitter who was due to come and stuck her head in the oven in that little house in England, which was so cold that winter. And we don't, there's a real debate about whether she intended it to go all the way or not. But we don't read these because of that. We read these because they are amazing poems. And here is one of the amazing ones, and because of the time and because we're nearing the end of it, I'll shout at you. Because when she did these, the other poets, by the way, you can hear them there. I gave you a lot of sites on the sheets, and you can go and listen to them. They had very soft voices, very self-effacing voices. Not Sylvia Plath. And Sylvia Plath said she wanted to be the Emily Dickinson of her age. She said that. She was in competition with Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson had declaimed her own poems. We know that because the little boy across the street had heard them in the summer when the windows were open. We know that Emily Dickinson was quite an actress about her poems. Well, Sylvia Plath, too, did something I can't possibly do it. And if dear Sally could unmute herself and yell and scream at us, maybe she could. But in the absence of that, I'll do it. I'll try to do it. She says in this poem, I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately, just as it is, unmisted by love or dislike. I am not cruel, only truthful, the eye of a little God four-cornered. Most of the time I meditate on the opposite wall. It is pink with speckles. I have looked at it so long, I think it is a part of my heart, but it flickers. Faces and darkness separate us over and over. Now I am a lake. A woman bends over me, searches my reaches for what she really is. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. I see her back and reflect it faithfully. She rewards me with tears and an agitation of hands. I am important to her. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises toward her day after day like a terrible fish. Hello, world. There's a lot of pent up anger. And there is in her very famous poem, I gave you a clip that you can someday listen to, Lady Lazarus, where she says, oh gosh, I can't see the beginning of it because of this. I have done it again. Every year I manage it. A sort of walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. Her father was German. She was very angry at him for dying. She was very angry at the Nazis. Somehow they get mixed together in this. And she's writing a poem here, sort of like The Applicant, which is in your handout. Very angry poem also. But in this one, she's talking about suicide and comparing, the human to these terrible things in the 20th century world, post-Nazi, post-Holocaust world. And she ends it with, what's left of a human, you poke and stir, flesh, bone, there is nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling, Herr God, Herr Lucifer, beware, beware, out of the ash, I rise with my red hair and I eat men like air. Just pretty angry. Well, in the New Yorker of April 23rd, 2018, there is this poem. I don't know the poet, but listen to it. From where my students ask me why Sylvia Plath wanted to eat men, 2 men overdose. This is rural Ohio, and the new drugs from Columbus are cut with elephant tranquilizers. The police are nurses now. They don't dream. My students try to understand why the voice in the poem brags about death but never dies. Not a mile from here, 2 men regain consciousness. And the poem goes on and it ends, not a mile from our classroom. Men dissolve like powder in water. Men so close we can't see them. Men like air. So you see the currency, the power of this poem by Sylvia Plath has in today's world. Students and people are still reading it and still being moved by it, and by her very sad life. Her husband, in the end, praised her and praised her poems, as did her daughter. But I don't want you to leave tonight, and we're supposed to leave. I don't want you to leave with that tone. So just a quick introduction to this beautiful lady who was our poet laureate. You can look up, just put Tracy K. Smith in and enjoy her after this. She is just absolutely delightful. Her father worked on the Hubble telescope. And so the last page in this handout that I gave you on modern poets is about her having seen Emily Dickinson poem in the 3rd grade in a reader, and forever after having Emily Dickinson in front of her. So she was the reader at the Folger at one of the Emily Dickinson birthday parties. And you can see the little part from her memoir there where she kept saying, "I'm nobody, who are you?" That became her poem. And you can also see Emily Dickinson in several different examples I've given you. One of them is the last page of the handouts of Emily Dickinson poems, where the last poem is not Dickinson's, but Tracy Smith's. But I think a better way to end is The Weather in Space and the Soul, which will send you out without the anger of Sylvia Plath, or the sadness of Adrienne Rich, or the weirdness of Marianne Moore, or the ambition of the other daughters of Dickinson. Here's a contemporary one, and she says, I guess we'll just read The Soul. The voice is clean, has heft, like stones dropped in still water, or tossed one after the other at a low wall, chipping away at what pushes back, not always making a dent, but keeping at it, and the silence around it is a door, pinched through with light, a garment that attests to breasts, the privacy between the thighs. The body is what we lean toward, tensing as it darts, dancing away, but it's the voice that enters us, the voice that enters us, even saying nothing, over and over, absently to itself. And you'll remember that silence is very important to Emily Dickinson too in her poetry. She has a number of poems about that, but we have run out of time, more than run out of time. And I appreciate so much that you didn't just cut us off as we came to the end, but I don't know if we have any time and you want to go back. Well, I'll exit this. Well, one more slide, of course, to remind me where we are and who we're dealing with. And then we'll stop share and go into the gallery. Hi, everybody. And you're still there and your eyes are open. And I'm very sad that I didn't work out to hear you. Any of you, that was too bad that didn't work. I thought it might work. So it was all me and I apologize for that. But now you can speak, you can raise your voice. I don't know, you can cut us off or tell us how much time we have, Stephanie.
Well, if you guys are able to stick around and Ellie has some time to answer questions or hear your comments or thoughts, I would love to do that. I certainly have the time to do that. But if you have to leave, of course, we understand. We know it's getting a little bit later here on the eastern side of the country. And I want to thank you for joining us if you do have to
Yeah.
leave. But if you want to stick
You
around,
had
that would be
much more,
lovely.
you had much more fun options about chickens and yoga and things that were a whole lot more fun than listening to somebody read poetry for a long time. But I'm really delighted to share a large part of my post-Wooster life because it all started at Wooster. And I know for all of you, a lot of, that's where your lives started too. So anybody who wants to say anything or ask anything, raise your hand and you can be unmuted, right? Can they unmute themselves, Stephanie?
Not yet, but I'll follow along, and we can start with Jill. Hi, Jill. Good to see you again.
That's me. Are you, Eleanor, are you related to Robin Higginbotham?
Yes. Are you in her class?
Yes.
Class of 85.
Oh, I was 84.
Yes.
But
Well, she's 2 years because she took a year out.
Oh, okay. So she's your,
Yes.
How are you, like, she's your
She's my daughter.
daughter.
She's
Okay.
my daughter.
Wow.
And in spite of everything, I'll claim her.
Yeah, anyway, it's just nice to have that. I thought, with a name like
Yes.
Higginbotham, you don't see that too often, except in that one novel that you said, but anyway, whatever.
She did a remarkable IS. I just got to brag. She did take a year out. She had a hard time at a certain point. And then she did this, oh goodness, Galatia was her advisor. And she did a translation of the work of Kanzaburo Oe, who wasn't well known in Japan. And she did a discussion of him sort of like Huckleberry. The book was like Huckleberry Finn. And it did get honors that year when she finally finished it. And years later, I'm driving down the freeway in Minnesota, and on the radio, I hear that Kanzaburo Oe has won the Nobel Prize for Literature, this unknown Japanese writer. And I'm screaming at the radio, Robin Higginbotham wrote about him in Worcester in 1985.
That's awesome. Well, anyway, I don't know if she'll remember me, but I do have thank you for that. I have a question. Like I'm in some writing groups, and when can you take a quotation from a poet and turn it into like a poem or story? Like I know a lot of authors put it at the top of before the chapter begins, they'll do a quotation and then, they write their chapter of their, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
Can you actually spin off of,
Sure.
It is the voice that enters us. That's a great
Yes.
line by Tracy Smith, but can I actually like say that in a poem
Yes.
without saying this is by
Yes.
Tracy Smith?
I mean, you can write you can do a note, a little footnote to it, and that's interesting from where it comes. And one of the poems in the packet, the poem by Adrienne Rich about Half Cracked to Higginson, that's a quotation from a letter. And a lot of that is quotations from letters. A lot of that poem are quotations from letters. And she just depended on people knowing the story of Higginson and Dickinson, and answering it. My answer would be that yes. And Emily Dickinson did that with Aurora Leigh, as I said. She borrowed heavily, and she borrowed from Longfellow. She borrowed from lots of people. Hamlet. I wrote a whole article on Hamlet. So she borrows lines.
You don't
freely.
have to say like, as Emily Dickinson, you just, especially when you're writing poetry, you can just quote other people's stuff and then make it your own poem.
But it probably helps people if you put a note in the book.
Yeah.
If you publish it, to give.
I mean, I kind of knew the answer to the question, but I just wanted to hear, because this is beautiful stuff. Like I wrote down a lot of things that I just like, oh, this would be good, this would be good. But then I thought, I don't want to plagiarize, I don't want to just
plagiarize.
Okay.
It's great. It's called borrowing and echoing and honoring, I think.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
So anybody else want to say anything or ask anything? Our number will dwindle, I know.
Hey, Karen. You should be able to unmute yourself.
I'm just curious about what led you down the road of studying Emily Dickinson and her daughters.
Okay. Are you related to Peter?
Yeah, he's my brother.
Okay. All these relatives. Yes. Well, I've not recently, but late discovered that actually I heard him in the pulpit from my father, who was a Presbyterian clergyman. And he would say things like, as the poet says, if you can stop one heart from beating, you have not lived in vain. He would quote, as ministers will, hello, Brian, if you're still there, Byron, the gentler, more inspirational poems. He didn't know that there were some pretty rough poems about God in there. Like, it always seemed wrong to me, and then on to chastise God for not letting Moses get over into the promised land and things like that. But so I think I heard her first there, and then at Wooster, I certainly heard her, but in a different version with Clareson. He taught American Lit, and I remember his Whitman lectures very, very, very well, because that was the first time I heard about, somebody being a homosexual. It was okay to talk about that in a classroom. Oh my God. This is 1960, a long, long time ago. But so we, did that. But I'll tell you, the real time was 1986, when I had just been accepted as a PhD candidate at a late age. And I was going to write on a Puritan poet, but it was the centennial of Dickinson's death in 86. And every Dickinson scholar was at the Folger, jammed in that great hall. And they all gave papers for 3 days. And I had a boss who suggested that I go to it, that I take a day off and go to it. And so it was all Emily. And then I discovered the fascicles that had just come out, and games with them, doing lines from poem to poem, sort of the way I was doing on the two poems together, and discovering all the gamesmanship she was up to in them. And so I decided that I would write my dissertation on them. Although, first of all, I was going to do her Milton, her Adam and Eve, because she definitely sides with Eve. And even with Satan, she's sympathetic. There's a lot of poems, including some in your packet, where some character